Welcome to Nightmare Files, where real horror and chilling mysteries come to life. From eerie footage to unsettling stories, prepare for nightmares you won't forget. High school lockdown drills were nothing new. Every few months the alarms would blare, teachers would lock the doors. Students would sit quietly in the corners of their classrooms, pretending to hide from an imaginary threat. It was routine, predictable, pointless. Until the day it wasn't. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon, the last period of the day. Students were restless, counting the minutes until the final bell. I was in history class, half listening to Mr. Reynolds drone on about the Cold War, while most of the class scrolled through their phones under their desks. Then the announcement came. At first, it was the usual protocol. The principal's voice crackled through the speakers. "Attention all students and staff. We are now entering a full lockdown. This is not a drill." The classroom fell silent. Lockdowns had happened before, but never like this. There was something in the principal's voice, a tension, a fear. Mr. Reynolds immediately moved to lock the door. He turned off the lights. We all huddled in the corner, hearts pounding. Minutes passed. Then, something strange happened. The school's power shut off. Not just the lights, the air conditioning, the projectors, even our phones lost service. It was as if the school had been cut off from the rest of the world. And then, we heard it. A sound, echoing down the hallways. Footsteps, but not the hurried boots of a police officer, not the cautious steps of a teacher. These footsteps were slow, heavy, deliberate, and they weren't alone. There was something else, a whisper, faint, but unmistakable. A voice, speaking words none of us could understand. Then, the screaming began. It came from somewhere down the hall, a single blood-curdling scream, followed by another and another. We clamped our hands over our mouths, eyes wide, frozen in fear. The footsteps were getting closer. And then, they stopped. Right outside our classroom door. Mr. Reynolds pressed his finger to his lips, signaling us to stay silent. We watched in horror as the doorknob slowly began to turn. Click. The door was locked, but whatever was on the other side, it knew we were in here. And it wasn't leaving. The classroom was dead silent. The only sounds were our own breathing and the faint hum of the school's ventilation system. Outside the window, the sun was still shining. It felt wrong. Lockdowns usually happen during drills, but this was different. Then something changed. The air in the room felt heavier, like the oxygen was being sucked out. A shiver ran down my spine, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. I glanced at my best friend Mike. He looked pale, gripping the sleeve of his hoodie. Then he mouthed something to me. "Where's Danny?" I froze. Danny had been sitting right next to me, I was sure of it. But now, his desk was empty. I scanned the room, my pulse quickening. He couldn't have left. The door was locked, the windows shut, and yet he was gone. Nobody had seen him get up, nobody had heard a sound. One second he was there, the next he wasn't. Mr. Reynolds noticed us whispering. He gave us a sharp look and pulled out his laptop. We had a live feed of the school's hallway cameras. He probably wanted to check if Danny had somehow left. He opened the security feed, and that's when we saw it. The screen flickered. The footage was glitchy, cutting in and out. The hallway outside our classroom was empty, except, it wasn't. There was something standing just outside the door. A shadow, tall, motionless. But the strange part? The lights in the hallway were on, and yet the shadow didn't belong to anything. There was no one there to cast it. Mike whispered, "Dude, what the hell is that?" And then the shadow moved. Not walking, not stepping, just shifting, like it had noticed us watching. Mr. Reynolds slammed the laptop shut, his face drained of color. "Nobody moves," he whispered. "Nobody even breathed." And then the doorknob started to turn. So the doorknob twisted. At first it was slow, cautious, then it jerked violently. Someone or something was trying to get in. Mr. Reynolds raised a finger to his lips, eyes wide with fear. We didn't need the reminder. Nobody was breathing, nobody moved. The entire classroom was frozen in terror. Then the lights flickered, and for a brief second, we saw it. A silhouette, right outside the door. Not moving, not knocking, just standing there, watching us. The whispering started then. At first it was soft, almost like a draft slipping under the door. Then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I had ever heard before. It sounded wrong, like something trying to mimic human speech, but failing. It sent chills crawling down my spine. And then the whispering turned into a single, clear word. "Open." A girl in the back started sobbing. Mr. Reynolds waved frantically for her to stop, but it was too late. The whispering stopped. The room fell silent. And then the door handle snapped downward. The door flung open, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no shadows. Just nothing. We all stayed still, too afraid to move. Then I turned to look at Mike, and Mike was gone. No noise, no movement, no trace of him at all. Just gone. I turned back toward the door, and it slammed shut, locking us inside. The air in the classroom was suffocating. It was as if something was pressing down on all of us. Mike was gone, just gone. We had all seen the door swing open. We had all felt the cold rush of air. But none of us had seen him leave. Because he hadn't. He had just disappeared. Mr. Reynolds was shaking. I had never seen a teacher look so terrified before. He opened his laptop again, fumbling with a security camera feed. The hallway outside our classroom was empty. The door was shut. But then the screen glitched, and we saw it. A shadow, standing inside the classroom. It wasn't one of us, it couldn't be. It was in the center of the room, tall and motionless, a void of darkness, darker than the unlit corners of the class. But when we looked around, the room was empty. There was nothing there. Only on the screen, the figure remained, standing, watching. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and the whispering came back. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the air. We covered our ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside our heads. And then, one of the whispers became clear. "Let me in." A girl screamed. The lights cut out completely. So the lights went out completely. Not just the overhead lights, the emergency lights, the hallway lights, everything. The classroom was bathed in complete, suffocating darkness. Someone let out a small, choked sob. Then another. A rustling sound as students reached for their phones. The soft glow of screens illuminated the room. And that's when the screaming started. Every single phone screen showed the same thing. A live feed of the classroom. But in the center of the room, a tall, shadowy figure stood perfectly still, unmoving, faceless, only visible through the screens. But in reality, there was nothing there. At least, not that we could see. I turned my phone away, hoping it was just a glitch. But when I raised it again, the figure was closer. A girl gasped. Her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The moment it hit the ground, the screen shattered. And in that exact moment, she vanished. Students started crying, some whispering prayers under their breath. Mr. Reynolds moved quickly, pulling out his phone. He turned the camera toward himself, then to the students, then to the door. Nothing unusual. Then, slowly, he turned it to the center of the room. And the screen glitched violently. The shadow was still there, but now, it was facing him. Then, it moved. The room filled with a deafening, distorted noise, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't coming from the room. It was inside my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted, willed it to stop. And then, silence. I opened my eyes. The lights were back on. The room looked normal, but 3 more students were gone, their desks empty. The classroom was in chaos. Some students were crying, others were whispering prayers, a few just sat frozen, staring blankly at their phone screens. Because no matter how many times they pressed the power button, the screens wouldn't turn off. Every phone, tablet, every laptop in the room was stuck on the same image. The security camera feed, and what it showed, made my blood run cold. All the missing students were standing in the hallway, lined up in perfect rows. Not moving, not speaking, just facing the door. Their faces were blurred like static interference. Their bodies were rigid, unnatural. And then one of them moved. At first it was subtle, a twitch of the head, a shift of the shoulders. Then the nearest one took a step forward. The screen flickered. And another step. Then another. They were walking, but their movements weren't normal. It was as if they weren't in control of their own bodies. And they were heading straight for the classroom. Mr. Reynolds slammed his laptop shut. He turned to us, his face pale. "We have to stay quiet," he whispered. But then, the door handle turned again. Slow at first, then violently. A knock, 3 times, slow, rhythmic. Then a voice that sounded like Mike. "Let us in." But I knew. That wasn't Mike anymore. The knocking started again, slow, rhythmic, 3 soft taps against the door. Then silence, and then the voice. "Let us in." It was Mike's voice. But something about it was wrong. The tone, the inflection, it was hollow, empty. Like someone imitating him but not quite getting it right. The knocking came again, harder, more insistent. Then another voice joined in. A girl's voice, one of the students who had disappeared. "Please open the door, we're scared." Someone whimpered in the corner. A girl was clutching her knees, rocking back and forth. Mr. Reynolds motioned for us to stay quiet. But then, the door handle jerked violently. Whatever was outside wasn't asking anymore. The pounding grew louder. The walls shook. The windows rattled in their frames. "Let us in." The voices were warping now, overlapping each other. Multiple tones speaking at once, merging together in a terrible inhuman chorus. "Let us in. Let us in. Let us in." I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to drown it out. And then it stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. The air was thick, pressing down on my chest like a weight. Then I heard it. A whisper. Right next to my ear. We're already inside. The lights flickered violently. The room was filled with deafening static. I turned to my left and saw a shadow standing right next to me. Not outside the door, not in the hallway. Inside the classroom. The shadow in the security feed was moving. Not walking, not running. It glided. A slow, unnatural drift toward the center of the room. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. The classroom was empty. No figures, no shadows. Just terrified students and a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. Then the lights flickered violently. A girl screamed. Another knocked over a chair, scrambling backward. The screen glitched violently. The shadow was now standing behind Mr. Reynolds. He didn't react. He couldn't see it. But I did. And then it reached out. Mr. Reynolds gasped, clutching his throat. His body jerked as if something was pulling him backward. Sandy. But there was nothing there. We watched in horror as his feet lifted off the ground. Just an inch. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. He stumbled forward, coughing violently. I turned to the security screen. The shadow was gone. But the screen wasn't empty. It showed the hallway outside. The missing students were still there. But now they were smiling. Their faces stretched unnaturally, their eyes completely black. And then, for just one frame of static, something else appeared behind them. Something tall, wrong, watching us. And then the power cut out completely. The lights flickered once, twice, and then darkness, not just the classroom lights, the hallway, the security monitors, even the emergency exit signs. Every single light in the school went out. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone whispered, "Turn on your phone flashlight." A dozen screens lit up at once, casting eerie bluish glows across the room. And that's when the screaming started. Because every single phone was showing the security camera feed. The shadowy figure was no longer at the door. It was inside the classroom, standing in the center, perfectly still. But when we looked up, the room was empty, at least to the naked eye. I waved my phone around, trying to shine the light on where the figure should be. Nothing. But then, my flashlight flickered. For a fraction of a second, just long enough for my brain to register it, a face, right in front of mine. Mouth open, eyes empty. Then, gone. Someone gasped. Another phone clattered to the floor. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling us. But nobody was moving. Nobody, but it... "Everyone stay still," Mr. Reynolds hissed. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped. Right behind one of the students. A girl. Sitting closest to the center of the room. Her breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes. And then, she started floating. We screamed. We tried to grab her, to pull her back. But she was being lifted. No, dragged. Toward the ceiling. Like invisible hands had taken hold of her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her arms flailing, reaching for something, anything. Then with a gut-wrenching snap, she was gone. Vanished, like she had never been there. The room fell into a stunned silence. Mr. Reynolds grabbed his laptop. The security feed was still on. The shadow was there, now at the back of the room. Watching, waiting. And then, it took a step forward. The security feed blinked. Static crackled across the screen. Then around the hallway reappeared, and we saw them. They weren't just standing in the hallway anymore. They were everywhere. Figures pressed against the classroom windows, their hands splayed on the glass, their heads tilted unnaturally. Some had their faces completely obscured by darkness. Others, their faces were stretched, distorted, as if the image was being corrupted in real time. And the worst part? Some of them looked exactly like the missing students, but wrong. A girl in the back whimpered, What is this?" Nobody answered. We didn't have answers. The only sound was the hum of static from the laptop and the flickering lights overhead. Then the knocking started again. It was slow at first. 3 taps, then silence. Then again, louder. Then all at once, every window, every door was hit at the same time. Bang, bang, bang. The sound shook the room. The students covered their ears. Some screamed. The glass didn't break. The doors didn't burst open. But the pounding wouldn't stop. "We have to go," Mr. Reynolds whispered. Nobody argued we couldn't stay. But we also couldn't leave. Because outside, through the glass, the figures weren't just standing anymore. They were smiling. And one by one, they started lifting their hands, pointing directly at us. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. We held our breath, our eyes locked on the door handle. Then, without warning, it twisted sharply. But it wasn't being turned from the outside. It was turning from inside the room. A girl let out a strangled gasp. Someone whispered, "No." Mr. Reynolds lunged for the door, pressing his body against it. "Help me hold it shut," he hissed. 3 students scrambled forward, pressing their weight against the doorframe. The handle kept twisting, jerking, and then it stopped. But we weren't safe, because outside, through the glass windows, the figures were still there. Only now, they were moving. Their hands pressed against the glass. Their faces distorted, not like a blur, but like static, shifting in and out of shape. Some were grinning. Some didn't have mouths at all. Then the first crack appeared, a thin fracture snaking across the window. Then another, and another. The glass was going to break. Mr. Reynolds whipped around. "We have to move, now." But before anyone could react, the security feed on his laptop glitched violently. For a split second, the screen flickered. Then it showed something new. Not the hallway, not the missing students. The camera was now showing inside the classroom, showing us. And behind us, standing between the desks. The shadows had already gotten inside. And they were watching us. The first window broke with an ear-splitting crack. Shards of glass rained down onto the desks, reflecting the dim glow of our phone screens. The figures outside didn't flinch. They didn't react. They just kept watching. Then another window shattered. And another. The glass clattered to the floor in sharp, uneven pieces. The figures began stepping forward. Not climbing through the window, not crawling over the desks. They were just appearing, 1 second outside, the next inside. And still, they were smiling. Somebody screamed, a boy near the front. One of the figures was right behind him, its hand on his shoulder. He twisted, trying to yank himself away, but the moment he moved, he was gone. Not pulled, not dragged, just gone. "Move," Mr. Reynolds shouted. His voice jolted us into action. We scrambled toward the emergency exit, shoving desks out of the way. The door was locked, of course it was. But Mr. Reynolds didn't stop. He grabbed a chair and swung it hard against the glass. It cracked, another hit, Another. Then finally, the glass shattered, and we ran. The emergency exit door swung open and we bolted into the hallway. For a brief moment I thought we were safe. Then I looked around, and my stomach dropped. The hallway was wrong. The lockers looked stretched. The walls seemed taller than before. And the worst part? The exit door we had just run through was gone. Just a solid wall behind us, like it had never been there. "Where do we go?" someone whimpered. Mr. Reynolds pointed ahead. "We head for the front doors. Stay together." We ran. But no matter how far we moved, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. The doors on either side didn't make sense. Some were upside down, others led to nowhere, just walls of concrete. And then the lights flickered. And we saw it. A figure at the far end of the hallway. It was too tall, its arms were too long. It didn't move, it didn't speak. But we could all feel it watching. Then the security feed on Mr. Reynolds' laptop glitched violently. For a brief second we saw something moving among us. Figures. Dozens of them. They were walking between us, touching us. But when we looked around, we were alone. "Keep moving!" Mr. Reynolds screamed. We ran. But the hallway wasn't ending. It was looping. No matter how far we moved, we kept passing the same lockers, the same posters, the same cracks in the floor. We were trapped. And at the far end of the hallway, the tall figure took a step forward. We ran. But no matter how far we moved, we weren't getting anywhere. The hallway kept repeating itself over and over. Same lockers, same posters, same exit signs that led nowhere. Like we were running in circles, like the school itself was trapping us. A boy stopped, panting, pressing his hands to his knees. "This is impossible," he gasped. "We should have reached the end by now." He was right. The school wasn't this big. It had never been this big. Something was wrong. And then someone tried the first door. A girl grabbed a handle and pulled it open. Instead of a classroom, it was a void. Black, endless, a space that shouldn't exist. The wind howled from inside it, pulling at her clothes. Then something reached out. A hand, twisted, unnatural, grabbing her wrist. She screamed as she was yanked forward. But Mr. Reynolds grabbed her, pulling her back just in time. The door slammed shut behind her. And when we opened it again, it was just a normal classroom. The void was gone. "Don't open any more doors," Mr. Reynolds ordered, his voice shaking. We nodded, too terrified to argue. But then, the security feed glitched violently. And for the first time, we saw them clearly. Not just the missing students, not just the figures in the shadows, but things moving between us, touching us, whispering, watching. And with every flicker of the screen, the tall figure at the end of the hallway moved closer. The hallway was collapsing in on itself. Not physically, not in a way we could see, but we all felt it. Like the school wasn't just a building anymore. Like it was alive, watching, rearranging itself. Mr. Reynolds grabbed my arm. "Stay close. Don't split up." I turned my head, scanning the students, but something was wrong. We had started with at least 12 people. Now, there were only 7. And I couldn't remember who was missing. "The front doors," and someone screamed. We have to get to the front doors on your August." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Everyone, stay together." We ran. But the hallway didn't end. No matter how far we ran, we weren't getting closer to the exit. Instead, the hallway kept stretching. Like it wanted to keep us inside. "Try a door," one of the students gasped. Mr. Reynolds hesitated, then grabbed a handle. He flung the door open, and we saw it. The classroom was from another time. Not just earlier in the day. Years ago. The desks were wooden, the chalkboard was cracked, and inside, students were sitting, perfectly still. They weren't moving, they weren't breathing. And then, one of them turned. Slowly, their head twisting unnaturally toward us. Their mouth opened, and Mr. Reynolds slammed the door shut. "Don't open any more doors," he shouted. But someone already had. Another door swung wide, and behind it was nothing. Not darkness, not another room. Just emptiness. A void, stretching forever, and standing at its edge, was one of our missing classmates, smiling. Before anyone could stop them, they stepped forward. And they vanished. The ground shook beneath us. The walls began to melt into the darkness. And behind us, at the far end of the hallway, the tall figure had taken another step. It was getting closer. Mr. Reynolds grabbed a metal chair. "So get back," he ordered. Nobody hesitated. We were trapped. The hallway was collapsing. The doors led to nowhere. And behind us, the tall figure was coming. The first swing of the chair hit the window. A loud, echoing bang filled the hallway. Though the glass didn't break. Mr. Reynolds swung again. Crack. A thin fracture appeared. "Psych! Again!" Someone screamed. "I keep going." He raised the chair. But then the lights flickered violently. The hallway stretched. The walls warped, melting into liquid shadows. Students screamed as the floor beneath us rippled like water. "Hurry!" someone shouted. Mr. Reynolds slammed the chair into the glass again. And then a hand burst through the crack. But it wasn't his hand. It was something else. Something from the other side. Something pulling itself through. The security feed distorted beyond recognition. The figures on the screen weren't just moving anymore. They were watching us. Their heads snapped toward the camera all at once. And then, the screen went black. The sound of static filled the room. And in the darkness, the whispering started again. The window was open. Our way out. We didn't stop to think, we just moved. Mr. Reynolds was the first to climb through, helping students over the jagged glass. One by one, we scrambled through. The hallway behind us was falling apart, collapsing into itself like a dying star. But the figures, they didn't follow. They just stood there, watching, like they were waiting. Then, we heard the scream. One of the students was halfway through the window. Their hands gripped the frame, their body dangling outside. And then, something grabbed their leg. A hand. Not human. The fingers were too long. The skin stretched too thin. It yanked them back, dragging them halfway through the society. They screamed, thrashing, "Help me!" Mr. Reynolds lunged, grabbing their arms, pulling, but the thing on the other side was stronger. Their body was being pulled in two directions, and then they vanished. The security feed flickered. For a brief second, we saw it. The entity. Not just shadowy figures, not just distorted shapes. Something massive, with limbs that shouldn't exist. Watching, waiting. Then the screen cut to static, and the lights finally went out. We stumbled outside, gasping for air. For a moment it felt like we had escaped, and then we looked around us and we realized the outside wasn't right either. The school building behind us was changing. The walls stretched unnaturally. The front entrance was on. Once is a corner near Bay. Where the doors should have been, there were just more hallways leading back inside. And beyond that was fog. Thick, endless, swallowing the landscape. We couldn't see the street, the houses, the sky. There was only gray nothingness. Then we heard them. Voices from the mist. Help us. We're still inside. Come back. The missing students. Or something pretending to be them. Do not move, Mr. Reynolds ordered. But one of the students took a step forward. Toward the voices. It's my friend, they whispered. I hear them. They took another step, and then they were gone. Not pulled, not dragged, just gone. Like they had stepped into nothingness. And the fog swallowed them whole. The security feed flickered on Mr. Reynolds' laptop. For a brief moment, the image stabilized. It showed the outside of the school. The certain students. Then the fog. Us. And standing just at the edge of the mist, dozens of figures, watching, waiting, smiling, and then the feed cut to black. Mr. Reynolds pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed. The rest of us stood frozen, surrounded by the mist. The air was thick, heavy. It felt like breathing through water. Somewhere in the fog, something moved. Come on, Mr. Reynolds whispered. The phone rang once, twice, then static. Not a dial tone, not an error message, just static. And then beneath the static, a voice? Hello? It wasn't human. It was too deep, too layered. Like multiple voices speaking at once. Who is this? Mr. Reynolds asked. The voice laughed. You already know. The fog shifted. Figures emerged from the mist. Some of them were our missing classmates. Their faces were blank. They weren't walking, they were gliding. More shapes moved behind them. Larger, wrong. Watching. Waiting. Run, Mr. Reynolds whispered. Nobody moved. We were surrounded. And then the security feed flickered. For a brief moment, we saw what was waiting for us in the mist. Something massive, with too many eyes, too many arms. Reaching, grinning, the screen cut to black. And the voice on the phone whispered, "You can't leave." She stood frozen, staring into the mist. There was nowhere to run. The school behind us wasn't a school anymore, The front doors had vanished. The walls had twisted into impossible angles, spiraling into themselves. And beyond that, the fog, endless, thick, hungry. Mr. Reynolds pulled out his phone again, no signal. He tried dialing, static. He tried screaming for help. The sound didn't echo. The fog swallowed it whole. And then, the voices returned. Come back. Come inside. It's safer in here. They weren't yelling. They weren't pleading. They were laughing. Low. Amused, like they already knew how this would end. And when I turned back toward the school, I saw them. Figures, lining the windows, standing in the doorways, waiting. Not just the missing students. There were others, older, teachers, people who shouldn't be there, people who had been here before. The ground beneath us shifted. The concrete rippled like water. Someone screamed. A student sank down to their knees, then lower. The fog was pulling them under. Run, Mr. Reynolds shouted, but there was nowhere to run. Only two choices. Back into the school, or into the mist. One by one, the students disappeared. Some ran for the doors. Some ran for the fog. None of them made it. And the security feed cut to black. The next day, the school reopened like nothing had happened. No news reports, no police investigations, and no one even mentioned the missing students. It was as if they had never existed. But the security cameras, they remember. Every night they still record movement in the empty halls. Shadowy figures that shouldn't be there. Footsteps echoing in the silence. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. What happened that day remains a mystery. But one thing is certain. The school doesn't want you to leave. It never did. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Have you ever checked a security camera and seen something that shouldn't be there? If you have, share your story in the comments below. Or if you have a terrifying real-life experience you want to tell, send it to us. Your story might be in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And the next time you walk through an empty hallway, make sure you're really alone.